Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7, we are going to be looking at essentially how memory works. So we're going to be looking into a lot of specifics about the way that different memory systems interact with one another. We're going to be learning about how we can apply some of these techniques to perhaps improve our own study habits. And we'll talk about amnesia and things like that. All right, so let's get into it. So if I were to ask you to try to recall from Chapter 6, that video series, what the last list of words were. I'll give you a hint. The first one starts with moth. So I want you to try to remember what those words were. I think there was like 10, 15, something like that. Give it a shot. Test yourself. See how much you remember. Most people probably do not feel super confident in that, right? So the question then is, what happened to that information? So were those words actually forgotten? Were they in your head somewhere, or were they gone? So here is that list, just to remind you one more time. Hint, hint, hint. You may not have seen the last of these yet. So what we're talking about in this chapter is we're going to return back to priming. That's where we're going to start off, and pretty much by the end of this video, we're going to start and stop on priming. So we're going to kind of bookend the chapter using priming. Along the way, we're going to be talking about different kinds of memory tricks that you can use, and we'll also be talking about the difference between explicit and implicit memory. All right, so where we left off last chapter, we were talking about priming, and I mentioned about how priming was a way in which a stimulus influences or I guess I should say a previous stimulus influences the way that you respond to something right now. So the example that we gave here was whenever you have you're being asked, do these words are they real or not? Are they real words, or are they fake words? And participants that were doing this were judging that based on these pairs that occurred. So you might have a pair that's like phone and coffee or something like that, and you had to judge that. Or you could have skull and flube, right? And we would say, okay, well, one of those is fake. But the curious thing happens is whenever you have two words that are associated in one way, responding tends to be faster. People are faster whenever those two words are related in some way. And we talked about that in terms of the spreading activation model of memory, right? So the textbook goes into a little bit more detail this time about the spreading activation model here. So just to kind of show you what that looks like here for priming, this is some of the actual data from that 1971 paper that essentially whenever the first word and the second word are related, that you do see a pretty big difference in terms of the reaction times, that people are faster there, and it's a very reliable finding. That is priming. Essentially, you have one word that influences the way that you respond to another word. The other example that we were talking about, which we will come back to, is the word stem completion task, where you're looking at this information and you're trying to fill this word stem. So you're trying to take these three letters and add letters to it to make it into a word. And we talked about how if you saw this previous list, you are more likely to use the word moth, you're more likely to use the word supreme, you're more likely to use the word crayon, and so on, because you have previous exposure to that. If I were to just show those word stems to somebody who had never seen that list before, then we could bet that they would use different words probably. They'd use the word motel or mother for this one in particular. So you get the idea. The previous stimulus is influencing the way you're responding. All right, so that is a very different kind of memory than what we normally think of as memory, or at least for me, that's true. And that's because memory is divided into lots of different subtypes. And we talked about this at the very, very beginning of Chapter 6, that for memory, we have essentially two big splits, or I guess just to say two big halves. We have explicit memory and we have implicit memory. Those are the two big divisions. With explicit memory, we're going to be looking at memory that is conscious, that is voluntary, that is something that you can willfully do. And oftentimes whenever people think about memory, that's what they're talking about, right? Is that they're talking about your memory for lists of words or numbers, your remembrance of someone's phone number, of someone's birthday, of someone's name. All of these are things that are explicit. They are things you can consciously recall. But there's also an entire other system of memory that we don't normally think of as memory, but is just as important, and that is the implicit side of things. For the implicit memory side of things, we have these different kinds of forms of that, where we have procedural memory, which is like essentially knowing how to do something. So you can think about that as essentially muscle memory. The example that I love to give is tying your shoe. Whenever you're tying your shoe, if I were to ask you, how to tie your shoe, you could try to describe it, you could try to do that, but it would be very, very difficult. Generally, what most people do is they would want to show you how to do it, right? So that is because we're not very good at remembering how to consciously recall it, but we can indirectly show you by tying it ourselves and showing you by demonstrating it. The same is true for whenever people play instruments and try to explain what they're doing, or if they're trying to explain how they're singing, or if they are trying to explain how to play a video game, or anything like that. So that's procedural memory. That is a form of implicit memory. Priming, which we've just talked about, is a form of implicit memory. And these other two, we're not really going to go into too much detail about those this semester, but they are also super important. Perceptual learning is essentially training to recognize certain key perceptual experiences. One of my favorite examples of this is like at a post office. If you were to hand a postal clerk an envelope that is just a little bit too heavy, that probably requires 2 stamps, they are able to know just by holding it without even putting it on a scale, right? That is perceptual learning. They've done this enough times that they know what the correct weight for postage would be. And then classical conditioning, this is whenever you have learned associations among different stimuli. So thinking about, how a neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus and things like that. Again, we're not going to talk about that too much in this class, but if you have taken a learning class, you've probably heard about that stuff more than you want to, right? So what I want you to do now is to try to silently recall the list that I showed at the very beginning of this video, or at the end of chapter 6. So try to do your best to remember what that list was. Usually pretty hard, right? So I want you to think about how many of those words you remembered. You probably remember the first 4, right? You probably remember the first 4 because we went over them, right there in the priming, when we were talking about priming. But the question then is, did you forget the others? Did the others completely slip your mind? And so this is, if you did look at that list and you did try at the very beginning of this video, then this next piece should be interesting, I guess. Now you have essentially these word stems for all of those words. So I want you to now look at these and see if you remember any of these words now. I know you remember moth, I know you remember supreme, but what of these others do you now remember? Usually when I show this in the classroom, people will remember almost all of them. They will remember almost all of them. And partly, if you didn't, that's okay. It's a completely different context. In the classroom, we read all those aloud. But here, you're probably going to remember 1 or 2 that you didn't remember the first time, right? And so then the question is, what actually happened to those memories? Were they... Because you just showed evidence that you still had it, right? You still had that memory. then why couldn't you access it, right? That is going to lead us down kind of a really interesting path about the way that we recall and remember information. So whenever we are storing something into long-term memory, how long does it last? This is kind of a baffling thing. A weird way to think about it is that a lot of laboratory research shows that whenever something is really in long-term memory, it might be there kind of perpetually. It might be there forever. And part of that is based on the way that we are defining what long-term memory is. So, for example, going back to this example, if you do remember an extra word or two, then we can't say that information left your long-term memory, right? We can't say that you actually lost that memory because you just showed me you have evidence that you do remember it. So, essentially what that is showing is that if you couldn't remember it on your own, but you could remember it here, that what was actually lost wasn't the memory, but it was your ability to access that memory. In other words, whenever you had the right retrieval cue, maybe it's the way these words are, or the first few letters, then you do remember. That is essentially that you have lost the ability to retrieve that memory. And these words here, or I guess I'm trying to point. It's all reversed on my screen here. That you've just simply lost the ability to retrieve that information, but this is going to give you the ability to retrieve it. So these are called retrieval cues. Anything that helps quote-unquote jog your memory is going to be a retrieval cue. It is helping you access a certain memory. And so that's why whenever we say that experimental evidence suggests that long-term memory is infinite, it's because essentially the way that we are talking about this is that we don't lose the ability we don't lose those memories, but we lose the ability to retrieve those memories. I can guarantee that you've experienced this before where you're watching a TV show, an episode, and you're like, oh, I don't think I've ever seen this episode of The Office. And then maybe halfway through, you do recognize there's like a new character, or you recognize a famous quote, and you're like, oh, yeah, okay, I do remember this. Basically, that one specific feature is acting as a retrieval cue. It is helping access that memory that you thought that you lost. So here is a very cool study where basically these researchers were recording how well people did on vocabulary tests over 50 years. So they tested them for quite a long time. And what they did is, every few months they would drop in and they would test these people on a foreign language that they either had 1, 3, or 5 courses in. And essentially what they found is that regardless of how much training people had, that essentially people had the same kind of retention rates. That after about 50 years, people still remember a whole lot of that, even though they hadn't taken those courses in years, right? And so what this kind of helps emphasize is that once something is in long-term memory, it is there for good. Like, it is there for a while. We might lose the ability to retrieve that information, but that's okay. We just need to maybe find inventive and creative ways to try to access those memories. And that is what the next video is about. But before we get there, I do want to point out that this is very similar to Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. In other words, if you remember the forgetting curve, it was kind of like we forget a lot of things at first, right, in the first few hours, but then after the next couple of days, that forgetting rate starts to plateau, that it starts to even out. So what we're seeing here in this case is very similar to that. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to be talking about mnemonics. You've probably heard the word mnemonics before, and this is going to be a fun one. So I will see you in that video.